November 23rd, 1944. 42 German enemy soldiers sat in a Texas mess hall staring at something they hadn't seen in 6 years. And then they all started crying. This is Margaret Fisher Coleman, American citizen, grandmother. She's making banana pudding for her daughter's birthday party, and tears are streaming down her face. But 24 years ago, she was Margaret Fisher, enemy prisoner of war, who expected to die in this country. Her hands move with practiced efficiency, layering vanilla wafers and sliced bananas in a glass dish. The same recipe she learned from an American sergeant in 1945. Her daughter Rebecca, 8 years old with pure American accent, bounces into the kitchen. "Mom, why do you always cry when you make this?" Margaret touches the pale yellow banana slice with trembling fingers. "This is what saved my life." But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why banana pudding made a German prisoner weep, why it transformed an enemy into an American citizen, we need to go back to November 12th, 1944. Back to a moment when everything Margaret Fisher believed about the world was about to shatter. When that transport truck rolled through the gates of Camp Herndon, Texas, Margaret and 41 other German women believed everything their government had told them. That America was weak, starving, cruel to prisoners. They were about to discover that every single word was a lie. Margaret Fisher was 25 years old, communications specialist from Berlin. She had watched her city transform from vibrant capital into a city of rations, blackouts, and fear. Her father had been killed in an Allied bombing raid 2 years earlier. Her brother was fighting somewhere on the Eastern Front. She didn't know if he was still alive. She had stopped hoping months ago. Inside the covered cargo bed of that transport truck, Margaret pressed her face close to the canvas opening, catching glimpses of a landscape that seemed impossibly vast. The Texas sky stretched endlessly above them, unmarred by bomber formations or anti-aircraft fire. It was disconcerting in its peacefulness. Beside her, 21-year-old Greta Bauman clutched a small cloth bag containing her only possessions: a change of underclothes, a wooden comb, a photograph of her family in Dresden. Her hands trembled, though whether from fear or exhaustion, Margaret could not tell. They had been traveling for 3 days from the East Coast processing center. 3 days of uncertainty. 3 days wondering what awaited them at the end of this journey. They had been captured in France during the final Allied push through occupied territory. Serving as communications specialists, medical personnel, administrative staff for retreating Wehrmacht units. Now they were prisoners in a country most of them had been taught to despise. What Margaret didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that within 6 months they would face the most difficult choice of their lives. A choice between the country that raised them and the country that would show them dignity. But that choice was still months away. First, they had to survive their arrival. This is the story of how one Thanksgiving dessert, banana pudding, made by a Tennessee sergeant, would prove more powerful than 6 years of propaganda. How American kindness could transform enemies into citizens. How 42 women would be forced to choose between obligation and survival, between death and life. And how sometimes the smallest acts of generosity can change everything. If you or your family members served during World War II, or if you remember stories about prisoner of war camps in America, I want to hear from you. Share your memories in the comments below. And if this story resonates with you, if it reminds you of what makes America truly exceptional, hit that like button. It helps us bring more of these untold American stories to light. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about how America treated enemy prisoners. The truth is far more remarkable than you might imagine. But first, let me take you back to where it all began. November 1944, Allied forces had pushed through France. Germany was retreating on all fronts. The war everyone thought would be over by Christmas of 1943 was grinding into its 6th brutal year. Among those captured during the Allied advance, 42 German women serving as communications specialists, medical personnel, and administrative staff. Female prisoners of war were rare. Female German prisoners of war in Texas, almost unheard of. These women had been taught that American prisoner of war camps were death traps, that Americans showed no mercy to captured enemies, that they would face starvation, abuse, cruelty. The propaganda had been relentless for years. America was weak, they were told. America was losing. America was cruel. They believed it because they had no reason not to. After all, they themselves were starving in Germany. Their cities were burning. Why would their captors treat them any better? The truck came to a stop with a metallic screech of brakes. The tailgate dropped open with a clang that made several women flinch. American soldiers stood waiting, their uniforms crisp despite the Texas heat. And then Margaret saw something that shocked her more than anything she had experienced in 6 years of war. A woman in officer's insignia stepped forward, tall, professional, her expression neither cruel nor kind, simply efficient. This was Captain Eleanor Walsh, though the German women would not learn her name until later, a female commanding officer. The concept was almost incomprehensible to Margaret. In the Wehrmacht, women served in support roles, never in command. Yet here stood an American woman with the bearing and authority of a military leader. It was Margaret's first hint that perhaps everything she had been taught about America might be wrong. The processing began immediately. The German women surrendered their few remaining possessions for inventory. They received clean prison uniforms marked with large block letters. They were assigned bunks in a long wooden barracks that smelled of fresh pine and disinfectant. The entire process took less than 3 hours. American efficiency, it contradicted everything they had been told about chaotic, disorganized America. But it was not the efficiency that caught Margaret's attention as they walked toward their barracks. It was not the clean uniforms or the orderly compound. It was the smell. Cooking food. Real food. Not the thin soup and black bread that had sustained Germany for years. Something else entirely. Something that made Margaret's stomach clench with a hunger she had almost forgotten how to feel. By 1800 hours, Corporal Sarah Mitchell, a warm-voiced woman from Georgia with kind eyes, led them to the mess hall for their first meal. Margaret noticed immediately how the American guards maintained their distance but showed no obvious hostility. A young soldier held the door open as the women filed inside. The gesture was small but unexpected. In their experience, prisoners were herded, not accommodated. The mess hall was larger than Margaret had anticipated. Long tables arranged in neat rows. The November evening sun streamed through western windows, casting golden light across the room. But it was not the architecture that caused Margaret to stop and stare. It was not the clean floors or the orderly arrangement of tables. It was what waited on the serving line. Sergeant William Hayes stood behind the steam tables with 2 kitchen assistants. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s from Tennessee with flour permanently dusted into the creases of his hands. He had been cooking for the Army since 1942, and he believed one thing absolutely. A well-fed soldier was a soldier who could think clearly. He extended this philosophy even to prisoners. The German women moved through the line in stunned silence. Margaret watched as each tray received portions of food that seemed incomprehensible given their understanding of wartime rationing. Roasted chicken, not the stringy, scarce meat they remembered from Germany, but actual substantial pieces with crispy golden skin. Mashed potatoes with butter. Real butter, not the gray margarine substitute they had eaten for years. Green beans, dinner rolls that were still warm, and on each tray a small cup of what appeared to be fruit cocktail. Margaret accepted her tray with hands that shook slightly. She had not seen food like this since before the war began. In Germany, even officers received meager rations. The civilian population survived on ersatz coffee, made from acorns bread, stretched with sawdust, and whatever vegetables could be coaxed from victory gardens. Yet here in a prison camp, they were being served a meal that would have been considered luxurious in Berlin. Helena Schmidt, 29 years old, with steel gray eyes and rigid military bearing, whispered in German to Greta, "This cannot be real. It must be some kind of trick." But the food was real. The aroma was real. And when they sat at the long tables and took their first bites, the taste was undeniably, impossibly real. The chicken was tender. The potatoes were creamy. The butter melted on their tongues like a half-forgotten memory of better times. Margaret chewed slowly, trying to process what was happening. Her mind raced with calculations. America was fighting the war on 2 oceans, supplying allies in Europe and Asia, maintaining millions of soldiers in the field, and yet they could serve prisoners meals like this. The propaganda had said America was weak, starving, on the verge of collapse. But the food on Margaret's tray told a different story. It whispered of abundance, of resources so vast that even enemies could be fed well, of a nation that could fight a global war and still maintain domestic prosperity. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. That night, lying on her bunk in the barracks, Margaret could not sleep. The other women whispered in German, processing their first day. Some maintained that the food must be temporary, a trick to lower their guard before the real cruelty began. Others were less certain. The food had been too real, the abundance too genuine. Something did not align with what they had been taught. Helena maintained her rigid distance from everyone, speaking only when necessary. Anna Hoffman, the 23-year-old translator from Heidelberg, practiced her English, quietly preparing herself to be useful. Young Greta cried softly into her pillow, homesick and terrified and confused. But Margaret simply stared at the ceiling, thinking about butter. Real butter, on mashed potatoes, for prisoners. The weeks that followed established a routine that felt increasingly surreal. Each morning they woke to reveille, performed assigned duties, maintaining the camp facilities, and attended English language classes offered by Corporal Mitchell. But it was the meals that continued to challenge everything they thought they knew about wartime America. Sergeant Hayes's kitchen produced food with a consistency and quality that seemed to mock the propaganda they had been fed. Every meal brought new impossibilities. Bacon for breakfast, not the thin strips they remembered from peacetime Germany, but thick slices that sizzled with fat. Fresh eggs, toast with jam. Coffee that was actually coffee, not the acorn substitute that had become standard in Berlin. Margaret found herself assigned to administrative duties, helping to organize camp records under Captain Walsh's supervision. The work was tedious, but it gave her access to something precious: American newspapers. She read them voraciously when Walsh was occupied elsewhere, trying to understand this country that had captured her. The newspapers shocked her as much as the food had. They contained advertisements, glossy images of automobiles, household appliances, abundant food products. During wartime, in Germany, newspapers had long since stopped carrying such frivolous content. Everything was focused on the war effort, on sacrifice, on the inevitable victory of the Reich. But American newspapers seemed to show a country where civilian life continued almost normally, despite the global conflict. Margaret read reports of the war's progress, Allied advances, casualty figures, military strategies debated openly, and most shocking of all, criticism of the government, of military decisions, of political leaders. In Germany, such openness would be treasonous. Writers would disappear in the night. But here dissent seemed to be tolerated, even expected. One afternoon in late November, Margaret sat alone in the administration office, reading an editorial that questioned a recent military strategy. Captain Walsh entered and found her there, newspapers spread across the desk. "Learning about your captors." Miss Fisher. Margaret flinched, caught in the act. But Walsh's expression was not angry, merely curious. "I am sorry, Captain. I should not have." Walsh waved a hand dismissively. "You're welcome to read them. Knowledge is not contraband here." She paused, studying Margaret with intelligent eyes. "What surprises you most about what you read?" Margaret hesitated, then carefully, in her improving English, "That you are allowed to disagree. With your government. With your military. In Germany, this would be impossible." Walsh nodded slowly. "That's what we're fighting for, Miss Fisher. The right to disagree. The freedom to question. The ability to seek truth even when truth is uncomfortable." It was a simple statement, but it lodged itself in Margaret's mind like a splinter. She thought about it during her duties, during meals, during the long evenings in the barracks. The Americans had abundance of more than food. They had abundance of truth, or at least the possibility of it. Anna Hoffman's language skills made her invaluable as an interpreter during daily camp operations. She found herself in frequent conversation with the American staff, her English improving rapidly through constant practice. Corporal Mitchell taught her idioms and slang. The guards shared stories about their home states, their families, their lives before the war. It was all so casual, so human, so unlike what they had expected. Helena kept to herself, maintaining rigid military bearing during her maintenance work. She spoke rarely, never smiled. Something haunted lived behind those steel gray eyes, but she shared nothing with the other women. Margaret watched her, sometimes wondering what private grief Helena carried alone. Young Greta worked in the camp infirmary with American medics who taught her new techniques, new procedures. They were patient with her broken English. They showed her photographs of their families back home. Slowly, hesitantly, Greta began to smile again. To remember that she was 21 years old and that perhaps despite everything, life might continue. On November 21st, a supply truck arrived at Camp Harrington. Margaret watched from the administration office window as crates were unloaded into the kitchen area. Sergeant Hayes inspected the delivery personally, his expression one of deep satisfaction. She could not see what the crates contained, but Hayes's reaction suggested something significant. That evening, the German women were informed that they would participate in an American holiday meal on November 23rd, something called Thanksgiving. Anna explained what she knew. A harvest festival, a day of gratitude, something uniquely American that combined religious tradition with national identity. The mess hall would be decorated. There would be special food. They were expected to attend. Margaret thought it absurd that their captors would bother creating festivity for prisoners. Yet she had learned in her weeks here that Americans did many absurd things, like feeding enemies well, like allowing them to read newspapers, like treating them with something approaching dignity. Perhaps a holiday meal was simply one more American peculiarity. The day before Thanksgiving, Greta was working in the infirmary when she overheard two American medics discussing the upcoming meal. They mentioned turkey stuffing, cranberry sauce, and then one of them said something that meant nothing to Greta, and Sergeant Hayes is making his grandmother's banana pudding. That evening, Greta asked Anna about it in the barracks. Banana pudding. What did those words mean? Anna's face changed. A flicker of memory passed across her features like a shadow. Bananen, Anna said slowly in German. Bananas. I remember them from before the war. Yellow fruit from tropical places. They stopped coming to Germany in 1939 when the British blockade began. The word triggered something in the barracks. A cascade of memories among women who had almost forgotten. Helena spoke, her voice uncharacteristically soft. I ate a banana in 1939. I was 23 years old. It was expensive even then. A luxury imported from some distant colony. Margaret closed her eyes, remembering. I saw them in Berlin markets when I was a child. Exotic. Expensive. My father bought me one for my birthday once. I was 12 years old. I haven't thought about bananas in years. Greta, the youngest at 21, shook her head. I was 15 when they disappeared from German shops. I barely remember the taste. The women sat in silence, each lost in private memories of a fruit they had not seen in over 5 years. A fruit that had become in its absence a symbol of everything the war had taken from them. Not just the fruit itself, but the world where such luxuries existed. The world before rationing, before fear, before everything changed. None of them could imagine that such fruit still existed anywhere in a world at war. None of them could conceive that somewhere bananas still grew, and people still made dessert, and life continued with small pleasures intact. And certainly none of them could have predicted what would happen when they tasted banana for the first time in over 5 years. That night, Margaret could not sleep. A simple fruit had become a symbol of everything she had lost, everything Germany had lost. The word banana echoed in her mind like a ghost of better times. She thought about her childhood in Berlin, her father taking her to the market, the exotic yellow fruit that seemed to glow with possibility. She thought about her mother, who was somewhere in that ruined city now, if she was still alive at all. She thought about her brother on the Eastern Front, about her father's grave somewhere beneath the rubble of Allied bombs. And she thought about butter on mashed potatoes in a prisoner of war camp in Texas, about Sergeant Hayes's satisfied expression when the supply crates arrived, about Captain Walsh saying that knowledge was not contraband here, about abundance in a world that should have none. November 23rd, 1944, arrived with unseasonably warm weather for late Texas November. The women had been instructed to gather at the mess hall at noon. As they walked across the compound, Margaret noticed that the building had been decorated. Autumn leaves, probably artificial, adorned the walls. Hand-drawn turkeys created by soldiers with artistic inclinations were pinned near the entrance. It seemed almost absurd that their captors would bother with such details for prisoners. Yet there it was, an attempt to create festivity in a place designed for confinement. Inside, the seating arrangement was different. Previously, Germans and Americans had maintained separate sections. Today, the tables were integrated. American soldiers sat at some tables, leaving others open for the prisoners. A young soldier gestured for Margaret and her companions to sit at a table near the serving line. His smile seemed genuine, encouraging, as if they were guests rather than enemies. And then Margaret smelled it. The aroma that filled the mess hall was unlike anything she had experienced in 6 years. Roasted turkey. She recognized it from childhood holidays, though turkey had become impossibly expensive in Germany even before the war. The scent was rich, savory, speaking of abundance and celebration and normalcy. Sergeant Hayes and his kitchen crew had outdone themselves. As the women moved through the serving line, Margaret watched in growing disbelief as each tray filled with food that belonged in memory, not reality. Roasted turkey with crispy golden skin, herb stuffing fragrant with sage and thyme, mashed potatoes whipped to creamy perfection, rich brown gravy, green bean casserole topped with crispy onions, sweet potato casserole studded with pecans, fresh baked rolls with butter, cranberry sauce both jellied and whole berry. Each item seemed more impossible than the last. This was not prisoner food. This was not even officer food by German standards. This was abundance on a scale that contradicted everything Margaret thought she understood about wartime sacrifice. But it was what waited at the end of the serving line that caused Helena to stop so suddenly that Greta nearly collided with her. In large glass baking dishes sat something none of them had seen in over 5 years. Layers of golden custard, smooth and perfect. Vanilla wafer cookies, their edges softened by the custard. And sliced bananas, pale yellow, exactly as Margaret remembered from childhood, topped with peaks of white meringue browned to perfection under a flame. The dessert seemed to glow under the mess hall lights, like something from a dream or a memory too precious to be real. Sergeant Hayes noticed their transfixed stares. He spoke slowly, his Tennessee drawl careful and deliberate, knowing that Anna would need to translate for those whose English remained limited. "That's banana pudding, family recipe from my grandmother in Tennessee. Thought you ladies might enjoy something special today." Margaret accepted her serving with hands that trembled. The pale yellow banana slice on top was exactly as she remembered, exactly as it had been in that Berlin market when she was 12 years old and her father had bought her a birthday treat. She carried her tray to the table in a daze, barely noticing the turkey or the stuffing or any of the other impossible food. Her eyes were fixed on the banana pudding, on the proof that somewhere in this war-torn world such things still existed. She sat down, picked up her spoon, and stared at the dessert as if it might vanish if she looked away. Around her, the other German women wore similar expressions: disbelief, wonder, and something deeper, something that looked almost like grief. When Margaret finally lifted the spoon to her mouth, when the first taste of banana pudding touched her tongue, the world shifted. The flavor was exactly as she remembered: sweet, creamy, the distinctive taste of banana that no substitute could replicate. The vanilla wafers soft, the meringue light and airy. And it was perfect, and it was real. And then she was crying. Tears streamed down her face before she realized what was happening. It was not simply the taste of the dessert, though, that was extraordinary enough. It was what the taste represented. A world she had lost, a normalcy she had forgotten existed, a stark reminder of everything the war had taken from them. She looked up through her tears and saw that she was not alone. Around the mess hall, German women sat with tears streaming down their faces. Some wept silently. Others covered their faces with their hands, overwhelmed by emotions they could not articulate. Helena's rigid facade cracked like ice in spring thaw. Tears poured down her steel-hard face. Anna wept into her hands. Young Greta sobbed openly, her shoulders shaking. 42 women simultaneously experiencing the same profound grief. Not for the banana itself, though that was part of it, but for everything the banana represented. For the world before the war. For normalcy. For small pleasures and simple joys. For everything they had lost and forgotten. They had lost until this moment. The American soldiers looked alarmed. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sergeant Hayes emerged from the kitchen, his expression concerned, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. But Corporal Mitchell, with her deeper understanding of human nature, simply moved through the tables, passing boxes of tissues without comment. She understood that sometimes kindness hurt more than cruelty because it reminded you of what you had been missing all along. Anna was the first to compose herself enough to speak. She wiped her eyes, drew a shaking breath, and addressed Sergeant Hayes in her careful English. "Sergeant, this banana we have not seen since 1939. In Germany, they stopped coming. First, they became very expensive, then impossible to find. We forgot that such things still existed in the world." Hayes looked genuinely surprised. He had known about rationing in Germany from intelligence reports, but he had not fully grasped what years without basic pleasures meant to ordinary people. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "in America we've got rationing too. Sugar, butter, coffee, meat. But bananas still come from Central America. They're not rationed, just sometimes hard to get. I had to request them special for today." Margaret found her voice, though it shook with emotion. She spoke in her improving English, wanting Hayes to understand directly without translation. "Sergeant Hayes, you must understand. For 6 years we have been told that America is weak, starving, losing the war. We believed this because we were starving. Our cities are burning. Our families are dying." She gestured at the banana pudding with her spoon. "But you fight war on 2 oceans. You supply allies everywhere. You maintain millions of soldiers in field. And still you have bananas. For prisoners. For enemies." Her voice broke. "This tells us that everything we were told was lie. You are not weak. You are not cruel. You are not what they said you were. And if that was lie, then what else was lie? What did we fight for? What did we lose everything for?" The mess hall fell absolutely silent. Even the American soldiers had stopped eating, sensing the weight of the moment. Captain Walsh stood in the doorway watching. She had orchestrated this meal knowing it would have impact, but even she had not anticipated the depth of emotion it would unleash. Walsh stepped forward, her voice quiet but carrying across the silent room. "You fought because you were told to, just like our soldiers. The difference is what we fight for. We fight so people can have banana pudding, so families can be safe, so there's something worth coming home to. That's what separates us. Not that we're stronger or better, but that we remember what we're fighting to preserve." Margaret nodded slowly, understanding dawning like sunrise after endless night. This was the answer to the question that had haunted her since her first meal at Camp Harrington. America was not just fighting against Germany, they were fighting for something. For the right to make banana pudding, for the freedom to criticize their government, for the ability to treat even enemies with dignity. Let me pause the story here because this moment represents something profound that I need you to understand. These German women had been taught for 6 years that America was weak, starving, losing the war. They believed it because they themselves were starving. Their cities were burning, their families were dying. The propaganda was consistent and relentless, and it matched their lived experience. But banana pudding told a different story. Not just about abundance, though that was part of it. It told a story about a nation that could fight a massive war and still maintain civilian prosperity. About a system so robust that even prisoners ate better than German officers. About values that insisted on dignity even for enemies. And most importantly, it proved that everything they had been taught was a lie. Think about the power of that moment. Not the banana itself, though that mattered, but what it proved. That their sacrifice had been for nothing. That the regime they had served had lied about everything. That they had lost their families, their homes, their youth to a cause built on falsehood. That's why they cried. Not from joy, though there was joy. Not from grief alone, though there was grief. They cried from the devastating recognition that they had been betrayed by their own country. If you're finding this story powerful, if it resonates with you, take a moment right now to like this video and share it. Because this is a story about what makes America exceptional. Not our military might, not our economic power, but our willingness to treat enemies with dignity. Our commitment to values even when it would be easier to abandon them. Our belief that abundance should be shared even with those who fought against us. Now let me tell you what happened next, because that banana pudding was just the beginning of a transformation that would change these women's lives forever. That evening in the barracks, Margaret could not stop thinking about Captain Walsh's words. Treating people with dignity is what separates us from those who don't. Such a simple statement, but it lodged itself in Margaret's mind like a seed waiting to germinate. She had asked a reasonable question during the meal. "Why do you feed us so well? We are your enemies. We expected punishment, not kindness." And Walsh had answered with that single sentence that contained more truth than 6 years of German propaganda. The conversation that began in the mess hall over banana pudding did not end there. It opened something that had been sealed since the women's arrival. A willingness to question, a permission to wonder, a crack in the wall of certainty that had surrounded them for years. Helena spoke that night, her voice uncharacteristically thoughtful. It is not just that they have food. It is that they can afford to share it with us, with their enemies. In Germany, we are starving and still told we are winning. But how can a winning nation starve while a losing nation feast? Anna had been reading American newspapers with increasing comprehension. Her English improved daily through constant practice with Corporal Mitchell in the Guards. What she discovered in those pages troubled her even more than the food disparity. They have abundance of more than food, she observed. They have abundance of truth, or at least the possibility of it. American newspapers criticize their own government freely. In Germany, such openness would be treasonous. Young Greta, still the youngest among them at 21, struggled most with these revelations. She had been only 15 when the war began. She had known nothing of adult life before Nazi control shaped everything. The world she was discovering in Texas bore no resemblance to the world she thought she understood. If everything we believed was false, she asked one night, then who are we? What were we fighting for? The question hung in the air without answer. Captain Walsh, making her evening rounds, overheard the conversation through the barracks window. She did not intervene or announce her presence. Some realizations had to come from within, could not be imposed from outside. The German women were beginning to understand that abundance was not about quantity alone. It was about a system that could maintain prosperity even under strain. About values that insisted on dignity even for enemies. About confidence rooted not in propaganda, but in genuine strength. December brought colder weather to Texas, though nothing